So far, every time we've encountered diatonic intervals, it's been in the context of measuring the distance between notes in a melody. For instance, when we were looking at the melody of Over the Rainbow, we started with that middle C, that is the first note of the melody, and we went up to the C that follows it, and so we measured the distance from that first C to the second C. And we measured, we said C1, D2, E3, F4, G5, A6, B7, C8. And we discovered that we moved through 8 notes, or we went up the interval of 8. And remember, we don't call it an eighth, we call it an octave. So we moved up the interval of an octave. And then we discovered we went from the C down to the B at the beginning of the next measure. And that interval is the interval of a second because we go C1, B2. And then we go from that B to a G. So we go B1, A2, G3. And so we have the interval of a third down. And then we could keep going with this. We have the interval of a second up, another second up, another second up, and then an octave down, and so forth. The key is, though, that we're measuring the distance between consecutive notes, between notes that happen one after the other. And that's one of the ways that we can measure intervals, is between notes that happen one after the other. And when we do that, we call these intervals melodic intervals, which makes sense because we're measuring the distance between notes in a melody. And since we're reading on the horizontal axis from left to right, we sometimes call these horizontal intervals as well because we're reading them or measuring them from left to right. But that's not the only way that we can measure intervals, because that's not the only way that we can play notes in music. We can play notes in music one after the other, but we can also play notes simultaneously. So for instance, suppose rather than playing the first 2 C's of Over the Rainbow, one after the other, suppose I decide to play them simultaneously. And let me write that down here on the bottom of the page. That bottom C and the top C right above it. Remember, we try to put notes that are going to sound simultaneously on top of one another, or align them vertically as best we can. And that lets the performer know that these are 2 notes that are going to happen at the same time. So now, rather than playing that C followed by the second C, I'm going to play these 2 C's at the same time. But there is still a distance between these 2 C's. There is still the distance of 8 notes. If I counted up from C to C, I would still get the interval of an octave. These kinds of intervals, where we have 2 notes sounding at the same time, are known as harmonic intervals, sometimes known as vertical intervals, because we're reading them along the up and down, or the vertical axis. And harmonic intervals or vertical intervals work exactly the same way as melodic intervals do. The only difference is we don't have, since they're happening simultaneously, we don't have a direction. We don't say, with a harmonic interval, we don't say that there is that this is an octave going up or an octave going down, because they're happening at the same time. We only use that phrasing of up and down when we're talking about notes that happen one after the other. And I could take any one of these intervals and rewrite it as a harmonic interval. Suppose I were to take, let's take the G and the B right here, the B and the G, and have those, rather than doing them one at a time, we're going to do them simultaneously. I'm going to write them as quarter notes. So instead of going B to G, I'm going to play them at the same time. B to G, though, is still the interval of a third. We've just written it as a simultaneous interval instead of an interval between two successive notes. Notice, by the way, this raises an interesting problem because, and let's go back to the C and the B of the melody. I'm going to write those down here. No, I'll write them over here. C and the B, which are the second and third notes of the melody. Here's C, here's B. That's the interval of a second. And I'll play that for you in just a second. But notice the interval of the octave. That sounds terrific when I play those two notes together. The interval of a third. That sounds pretty good together as well. But notice what happens when I play the interval of a second together. There's something a little bit more clashing or a little bit more biting about that sound. And in the next video, we will investigate exactly what that is.